1. This happened around a year ago. My friend and I had been out late, driving around and going to our favorite spots around town. And when the night came to an end, we parked in front of her house and just talked for a while. It was 3 in the morning. We live in a big city, but this is one of the safer parts of town. It was late. The conversation was dying down when we suddenly heard and felt the distinct sound and movement of someone opening and slamming one of the backseat doors or the trunk of my car. We looked at each other, looked back. We didn't see anything, but still felt on edge. We decided instead of calling it and her getting out, when we don't know what could be hiding near or somewhere in my car, we would go to our favorite diner and check the trunk of my car there. Let me cut in real quick to say this isn't a paranormal story, but you could say this is where the story starts. It's what led to the night continuing instead of it ending as we planned, and ultimately what led to the events that followed. This diner is a popular spot in town, open 24 hours and always busy. We'd befriended a few people who worked there and definitely felt it was the safest place to check my car. One of our friends who worked there checked with us nothing was in my trunk. We thanked them, and headed down the hill back towards home. We were a few blocks away from where we live, stopped at a red light and trying to joke off our little scare when we noticed him. We were in the left lane, he's in the car next to us in the right, a blue Camaro with a modified engine. He was distinctive, bright blue eyes and several tattoos on his arms and face that we could see. The one I remember most vividly is the red teardrop tattoo underneath his left eye. Our windows were up and our doors were locked. He rolled down his window and started catcalling at us. We laughed and ignored him. This was normal. We could see his friend in the front seat next to him laughing too. Then his catcalls changed. "Hey, I'm not from here. I'm not from here. Come hang out. Hop in." We started feeling a little more uncomfortable. We double-checked to make sure my doors were locked. The light was taking forever, but it was a straight shot to my friend's place. That's when he got out of the car, his keys still in the ignition and the engine still rumbling. "Hey, I'm not from here. I'm not from here." He started yelling as he banged on my passenger window and pulled on the door handle. He was leaning down and looking into the car. "I'm not from here." The light turned green. He was still standing at my passenger window. I looked at my friend, looked at the light, and zoomed off. I crossed into the lane furthest to the right. I wasn't going to lead this guy to my friend's house, and the police station was only a little less than a mile away. Right as I turned right, he zoomed up behind me, and I knew he was trying to rear-end me, and would have if I hadn't moved right then. I sped off towards the police station, him following behind. He gave up on trying to rear-end me and switched into the left lane, swerving and trying to ram my car off the main road and into the cars parked on the side. His passenger window was down and he was still screaming, "I'm not from here," intermixed with a few choice curse words. He was still trying to ram into my car from the side. And I still don't know how I managed to avoid him and avoid hitting any of the parked cars. The police station was only a few blocks away at this point. He tried to ram into my car. I swerved away into one of the residential streets. As he continued forward, I turned that swerve into a turn and zigzagged through the side streets. We heard his engine as he was searching the area for us. We took the side streets slowly, keeping an ear out for his engine and parking with the lights off for a few moments, if we felt he was too close. A few minutes later, we made it to the police station and pulled into the emergency zone. The entire chase took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. We called 911, something we hadn't thought to do at the height of it all. One came outside to escort us to our homes. There was a squad car waiting at the end of my friend's block when I dropped her off. Our escort home followed me to make sure I arrived safely. This is the only part of the night I have photos of the police escort. I haven't had an experience like this since, and I've been more careful being out late at night. I've seen the guy with the face tattoos once more since then, a couple of months ago. He was a passenger this time, staring into my car. I didn't notice anything until a different friend started making faces at him. I saw him, saw his blue eyes and his red teardrop tattoo, and I immediately told my friend to stop and got us out of there. I didn't need another experience like this again. To the man with the red teardrop tattoo, blue eyes, and blue Camaro to match, please, let's not meet. 2. I live in a picturesque, medium-sized city in Oregon. Because it has very little violent crime, I used to feel safe enough to walk around alone, and sometimes even did my jogging at night to avoid the heat of the day. People have told me this is unwise, but after living in cities that have a lot of violent crime, this one seems like a sandbox, and I've never worried about it. Until now, that is. After last Saturday, that sense of security is shattered. My foolish confidence is gone. I'll never, ever do that shit again. An out-of-state friend came to visit for the long Labor Day weekend, and I took her out on the town. Since it's a very walkable area, we parked my car on a residential street and set off on foot. We hit up a few bars and grabbed a bite to eat, just catching up on our lives and having a pleasant evening. I played tour guide and pointed out all my favorite spots. Eventually it got late, and we decided to head back to our starting point, which was about a mile away. We took a slightly different route so I could show my friend more of those gorgeous neighborhoods. We liked to look at the houses and compare our favorites. By then, night had fallen, but there were plenty of streetlights for visibility. After a couple more blocks, we turned down a particularly deserted street. Usually you'll see 1 or 2 people walking their dogs or simply strolling around like we were. I found it odd that there was literally no one else around, but again, since I'd never had any trouble, I brushed off the wariness I was beginning to feel. It was a holiday weekend after all. Maybe everybody was on vacation. As we approached the large elementary school to our left, we heard a low voice talking. There was a guy up ahead standing in the shadows on the opposite side of the street. He wore dark clothing and a backpack, and appeared to have a short beard. He seemed like an ordinary man. Granted, I couldn't get a very good look at him, but nothing about his appearance gave me pause. I assumed he was on the phone or talking to someone we couldn't see. When we got closer, I realized he was simply muttering to himself under his breath. Oh, great, I thought. Is he mentally ill, on drugs, homeless, or all three? Without acknowledging him or breaking stride, my friend and I continued our conversation as if we didn't notice him at all, and hoped for the best. To our dismay, the muttering grew louder. A few seconds later, my friend leaned toward me and said the words I was dreading. "He's following us." I looked over my shoulder to confirm, and sure enough, he had crossed over to our side of the street and trailed about 10 feet behind. I cannot stress it enough. There was no one else around, just the 2 of us and this maniac. We picked up our pace and scanned for a house that looked occupied, in case the situation escalated and we needed help. The streetlights got dimmer and farther apart, and the muttering never stopped. It seemed like the man wanted to get our attention, but not overtly. Like he wanted us to be aware of his presence without drawing too much attention to himself. We had no idea what he wanted, but we sure as hell didn't want to find out. Just when it was looking like we might have to break into a sprint, I spotted a house with a car in the driveway, and a bright porch light. We walked up to it as nonchalantly as possible, as if we lived there, but stopped just short of the porch because we didn't want to bother a stranger if our lives weren't actually in danger. We loudly talked about what else we were going to do with our night, making it sound like we might get in that car and drive off to meet my boyfriend at a nightclub. It seemed like a good idea to play it cool and wait for the nutter to move on. But he didn't fall for it. He saw we weren't going into the house and knew it wasn't ours. He stood on the sidewalk in front of it and cranked up the volume on his muttering. For the first time, I was able to make out what he was saying. Over and over he repeated, "There's no reason to be scared. I'm a human being. I'm a fucking human being. You can just come down here and talk to me. I know you're scared, but I'm a human being and you should talk to me. All I want is a cigarette, you fucking bitches." His tone was chilling, mostly monotone, but with a few angry notes peppered in, and the more he repeated himself, the more agitated he sounded. It's worth mentioning that while I do feel the city is very safe, the downtown area is fairly infested with aggressive vagrants. It's common for them to harass passers-by, but they don't normally stalk you like that. And we were far from the parts of the city where they hang out. I never would have guessed there would be a deranged creep lurking around a school in an empty, affluent neighborhood at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night. I mean, what the fuck? So my friend and I just kind of stood there looking at each other. We didn't want to engage this guy in any way because we didn't know how he'd react. He was clearly lucid enough to understand the situation. He knew we were afraid. He knew we were trying to get away from him, and those facts pissed him off. He reminded me of a dog that's frustrated its food bowl has been moved out of reach. We noticed the front door of the house was open. Should we go inside and explain that there's a scary, potentially insane person out there trying to lure us into talking to him? I contemplated it, but my friend stopped me, whispering, "What kind of weirdo leaves their door open wide this late at night?" We were both fully freaked out, and there just didn't seem to be any good options. After hearing more drivel about what bitches we were for being afraid, I almost told him to go away, but before I had a chance to screw up the nerve, he yelled, "Hey, yeah, you!" I stared at him expectantly. He pointed both index fingers at me and shouted, "Goddess!" before turning and silently disappearing down the street. My friend thought he was insulting me, like how you might call a snobby girl a princess. But it didn't sound that way to me. It sounded more like the type of last resort compliment a drunk guy at a bar or concert might offer up when he's trying to save face. It did not match the rambling, low-voiced stream of consciousness muttering he'd been doing before. And at that moment I knew for certain he wasn't some schizophrenic vagrant. Whoever he was in full control of his faculties and clearly had bad intentions. The crazy guy antics were an act. We waited until he was completely out of sight before sneaking away from the porch and backtracking to the previous cross street. Nobody ever came out of that house to see what the commotion was. And we were absolutely terrified the stalker might be hiding in the shadows, ready to jump out of the hedges or cut us off at the next intersection. We wanted to run but didn't because the sound of our shoes on the pavement might give away our location. We felt haunted. We felt like we were playing hide and seek with a murderer. We didn't relax until we made it to a more populated area with plenty of cars and pedestrians. Needless to say, night jogging is a thing of the past, and I now carry pepper spray with me when I leave the house. 3. When I was about 16 years old, I was a member of my school's honor society. That may sound like a needless fact, but it's what leads into the interesting part. So for the honor society, I was required to volunteer in my community. I loved everything healthcare related, so I applied to volunteer at the hospital. Little did I know I was 2 years too young to volunteer in the actual hospital. However, that same application showed me to apply to work at the donation-based thrift store in town. All the items sold were donations, and all the proceeds went to the hospital. Needless to say, I got the job or there'd be no story to tell. I went through all these tests and stuff to make sure I was someone who could uphold the image of the hospital in the community, and prove I didn't do drugs or have hepatitis or other diseases. Mostly because I went through the same screening as the volunteers in the actual hospital, it becomes clear later on in the story that they don't care so much about the volunteers in the store. So I was in high school at the time, and I could only work on Saturdays. I cashiered and cleaned up the store. I was scheduled for the morning shift, 7 to 12, but some days I would stay until 6 for the extra volunteer hours. It was a very laid-back place. I could literally haggle prices with the customers and throw items in for free if I wanted. Super chill place. So I worked a few weeks in the shop without anything exciting happening. But on about my 3rd week volunteering in the shop, this creepy older man started volunteering there. He was about 65 or more years old. I'm super bad at guessing ages, and it's been about 4 years since I worked there. And he dressed like a poor man trying to pretend he was rich. I vividly remember each of his fingers wearing giant gaudy rings, and he wore at least 4 long necklaces around his neck every day, usually accompanied by a long thin scarf if it wasn't too hot. I was only 16, and I have never been someone comfortable with being rude to others, so I always made conversation with him and let him look at the jewelry we kept in the display case by the register. One day I asked the little old lady I worked with, Pam, who he was and what he was in the store for. She told me he was doing his court-mandated service hours in the store, and that he shouldn't be a problem. He would just clean. However, I don't think she ever felt safe having him there, and neither did I. And we never knew why he was appointed service hours, like what he'd done. He never told me his real name. He always called himself Hollywood Rob. and spoke of himself in the third person all the time. I asked him about it once, and he snapped that his real name was unimportant, and that he always went by his stage name. Now I feel like everyone reading this so far is thinking, so what, you worked with a creepy old man. Well, the problem at this point in the story is the vibe this guy gave off. Never in my life have I ever been so completely uncomfortable around someone. The way he'd speak of himself in the third person, as if he was some amazing God-sent famous movie star who was helping the community by choice and selflessness, rather than some creep avoiding jail time. He'd put on all the women's jewelry we had in the store, waiting for amazing items to arrive, trying on all the rings and asking my opinion on them, though I never dared to say anything negative. He always had to put them back because he never had money, but when they'd get sold during the week, he was so angry and acted like he was going to buy them but had to wait a week. He acted like he owned them, and they were being stolen from him when the customers would buy them. And the way he never really cleaned the store, but rather hovered in the area of the cash register trying to keep my attention all focused on him. He had this thing he did every time I had to ignore him to help customers, where he'd huff and puff and sigh near the customers, trying to hurry along the interaction. When the older men who came into the shop paid me a sweet compliment, something grandfatherly like saying sweetheart or calling me a beautiful young lady, to their wife, he'd get all red-faced and angry. One day he went so far as to tell me that he lived not far from the shop, in a building that, in his words, isn't the best place to live, but I couldn't pass it up because it has these wonderful floor-to-ceiling mirrors on every wall. He said I just had to see it one day. I said I never have time to do anything but work and study, that my mom is always waiting for me to come home immediately after work, so that would never happen. I even said that I would never want to visit. I said everything I could think of to make sure he knew I was never coming to his house. Never. I made my mom aware of what he said, and she made me call every time I left the store and text her every half hour while I was there. Now these things were very creepy to me. While I could have been wrong about him, though I still would have tried to avoid him, I was naive, not stupid, I genuinely believed I was right, even if I had to base everything off how Pam acted whenever he came in. She never left the area either when he was around, always helping me to bag items or clean the front area more, maybe restocking some of the dishes and glassware we had in the front near the register. Like she never left the area. She'd make the dude who sorted the donations and priced them bring out a cart of things for her to work on, rather than leave for less than a minute to go and get them. Don't get me wrong, I'm so grateful that she did that for me. Pam was and is a great woman. She genuinely cared about me, and I cared about her. The customers were even creeped out by Hollywood Rob, and the younger college kids who'd come into the shop for shits and giggles would always comment to me how weird he was when they'd get to the register or on their way out. I was the only young girl Hollywood Rob saw while volunteering, because everyone else worked in the back, or the second half of the day after he'd gone home for the day. Hell, I think I was the only one under 40 during the mornings, and he was only ever there for about 2 hours at a time. I only volunteered at the shop for a total of 6 months before the store was permanently closed, as a new shop had replaced it. But I can honestly say I don't miss it one bit. By the end of my stint there, I was going out of my way to work the second half of the day and calling in sick to avoid him when I couldn't work the afternoon. I genuinely feared seeing him. He gave me anxiety. I basically stopped going in about a month before the store actually closed because I just couldn't do it anymore. While that alone was creepy, it gets a lot worse. As of now in the story, he's just a creepy weird dude. But as months went by, I couldn't stop analyzing how genuinely scary this guy was to me. All the things that could have happened to me working there. How stupid it was of me to stay there, no matter how much I liked the job and the people. I was finally forgetting him when I saw a post on Facebook. It was a picture of Hollywood Rob, though it had his real name. I can't remember it anymore because he's burned into my memory as Hollywood Rob. He was a suspect in over 5 cases of sexual harassment of young boys, like boys my age. I'm a girl, thank the Lord, but it terrified me. I didn't save the post or share it. I can't remember the exact date of the story, but it's out there somewhere. Never did the article mention his time in the thrift store or the name Hollywood Rob, so I can't find the article, though I just looked for about 2 hours. The only thing that reminds me it's real is my sister and mom, both of whom knew the whole story and were as terrified as I was to see him in the news when I showed them the article. We don't talk about it now. I remember finding out he was arrested, but I don't know specifically what for. The situation could have been a whole lot worse, though I'm probably a little old for his taste now. I sincerely hope we never meet again. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 429. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. You'd think 1:15 in the morning would be a safe time to record, but I can hear music and a lot of talking in the distance. I just hope the mic's not picking it up. Suppose I could close the window, but this time I really shouldn't have to. Okay, I'm on a marathon recording session right now. I have 16 more videos to record. It sounds like a lot, sounds daunting, but it's actually quite doable. So I'm going to keep my outros short for the next few videos, just to get through this, and when I'm done, then there'll be maybe more than a week off, depending how early I get done, and there'll be lots and lots of toe wiggling as I relax. Okay, and with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.